Good evening, I'm Yvonne, staff for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations. Our topic tonight is big agriculture's effect on food and health and environment, and our expert is Julie Guthman, professor of social sciences at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Dr. Guthman is a leading scholar on the history of California agriculture. And California is one of the top agriculture producers in the U.S., and it has an international influence. Dr. Guthman's research is unique in scope. She looks at agriculture in terms of multiple effects, especially socioeconomic, health, and environmental effects. She's received multiple book awards, and tonight we'll talk about her book on obesity from a while back, and also her current research on the strawberry industry. This past year, Dr. Guthman has been awarded both a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Francis B. Cashin Fellowship at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Research at Harvard. While she's here at Harvard, she's writing her next book on the soil pathogen that has affected the strawberry industry rather profoundly. We're very honored to welcome Julie Guthman. Thank you, and welcome to Cambridge too.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for having me on the show, and I'm very much enjoying being in Cambridge.
Oh, good. Okay. Then I would like to focus especially on these two books, your current research mainly,
Okay.
but to go back to a book that I think was very significant in that it was a more multidimensional approach to the issue of obesity. You made some very interesting points,
Right.
starting with the issue of obesity.
Right. Well, that was a very controversial book, and I understand that people love to teach it in the classroom
Great.
because there's always a vigorous debate. But the book came out of my observations about how the discourse of an obesity epidemic was being used in the alternative food movement, and a lot of my research has been focused on the politics of the alternative food movement, which is supposed to be in opposition to big ag or industrial food. And I was quite concerned about the way that obesity had crept into that conversation. So the book was really just a kind of an examination of all the assumptions about the obesity epidemic, and I challenged about 7 of them.
Yes. Would you mention a couple or
Well,
three or something?
I mean, the first one that's important is I challenge the idea that obesity is necessarily a health problem. I'm not saying it's not a health problem, but the way we understand the relationship between obesity and health is much more complicated than you get from the regular public conversation. And just to give you an example of that, a lot of, when we even look at what is a measure of obesity, we look at the body mass index, which is a ratio of weight to height. And I'm sure most of your listeners and watchers know that the BMI between 20 and 25 is considered normal, and between 24.9 and 25 to 29.9 is considered overweight, and over 30 is considered obese. Well, there's a bunch of stuff like that. I mean, when we even hear about a rising epidemic, what that means is on a population basis that one group, on a population-wide basis, there might be an overall gain of, let's say, 5 to 10 pounds, which is not significant, but that means huge groups of people move from one category to the next, which doesn't mean that everybody's really huge. It just means they've gotten a little chunkier or whatever. I don't even like using that term, than they were maybe a generation ago. But just in terms of the health effects, as it turns out, the epidemiological studies show that people in the overweight category actually have longer lifespans than those in the normal category.
That is a surprise.
That is a surprise, but it's like the source of this is somebody who worked for the Center for Disease Control, and she's published a lot on this.
Right.
So there's just so many assumptions like that. So that's one of them, the relationship between food and health. The idea that our our agricultural subsidies are making people fat.
How about junk food?
The junk food. The idea that it's calories alone that are making people bigger, that it's people's eating habits. And I think that's probably one of the most interesting things I came across. And I think what I'm getting at, because already your listeners are probably saying, of course it's calories, of course it's what we eat. Oh, first, I mean, just on the calorie business, I mean, now there's a lot of new evidence that it's not only calories, that calories, that carbohydrates can be causing bigness. And there's, I mean, we don't even
Sugar,
really understand the mechanisms by which people are getting bigger. But the big one was this idea that people are getting bigger regardless of what they eat.
And that was one of the best, I've assumed you're talking about like endocrine disruptors.
I'm talking about the chapter, and now I know more than I did even when I wrote the book. But this is, when I was writing the book, I'm just kind of a contrarian, and so I was just kind of curious, and I wondered if there was some relationship between environmental toxins and obesity, and I looked it up, and I found this article written by this British woman, Dr. Paula Bailey Hamilton, and she had an article that was all about other possible explanations for obesity that were outside of eating, and all sorts of studies that suggested that obesity could be related to toxins in the environment.
Right.
Since she wrote that, there's more and more who have written about this, and I mean, one of the main focuses has been about endocrine disrupting chemicals, and there's studies that show that when lab animals are exposed to chemicals in utero, when those that are exposed will become much bigger in adulthood than those who are not, even if they have the same fed the same diet and have the same amount of physical activity. So there's that, and now there's a lot of studies on that, and the focus has been on chemicals like bisphenol A in plastic bottles, and phthalates in hair products.
Yes. What is it? PF?
And that PFOA, which I can never pronounce it either.
We can always get the letters mixed up, but it's ubiquitous.
It's ubiquitous. It's ubiquitous, and these chemicals kind of came on. Well, first of all, it takes a generation for these things to manifest. So these kind of chemicals came online right when the folks that gave birth to people who are now bigger.
Good point.
Right? So there's that's a correlation like everything else, and there's a lot of correlations in the book I take apart, but I think it's worth considering. And now, there's more evidence about the relationship between stress hormones and obesity, like circulating cortisol, which may explain some of the associations betwing socioeconomic class and obesity.
That's another important thing in your book.
Right. Yes. And our microbiomes.
Yes.
Right. And now there's grave concern that the ubiquity of antibiotics in the food supply and in the environment may have affected microbiomes in a way that also may be inducing obesity.
Exactly. You came at this with a complex kind of model was your idea there that was particularly interesting, and you've pointed out a lot of this is not obvious immediately. You need time. So a generation that, as you point out, that will suddenly look quite different, and we can't say just stop snacking on the goodies there, but that contributes also, and we do see it. But
no, I'm not going to say that fast junk food is. I'm certainly not going to say it's good for you, because I don't think it is, but I think the problems with that kind of food are problematic regardless of whether it makes people bigger or not.
Exactly. There were many really very interesting points. Before we leave that book, I do urge people to read this. It's very readable, for one thing, for a general public, but it is one of the very few sources where you would see this complexity of the problem itself and how it's being addressed. You mentioned then, of course, the capitalist aspect of this, and I wonder if you go into this and the socioeconomics of this problem.
Right. Well, sure. I mean, a lot of my work has looked at how the dynamics of capitalism create some of the problems that we see as troubling. In that book, I think one of the main things I say is that so much of our political economy is based on excess.
Yes.
And we create a great deal of waste. I do not think that waste is what's making people big. I want to be really clear about that. But there is this sense in which consumption is supposed to help our economy. We're supposed to buy. We're supposed to purchase that.
Right.
That helps the economy, and yet we have a culture in which we're supposed to be thin and in control. So that's
a paradox. A contradiction.
Yeah.
Really,
so I call that the kind of culture of bulimia.
Yes.
And I don't mean that in a literal way.
Right.
I mean
I
on one hand
understand.
we're supposed to consume, and on the other hand we're supposed to not show
Exactly.
it. It's more than in food. It's in we're supposed to. Like the whole feng shui kind of decorative style,
That's
right? Be wealthy enough to get rid of all your stuff.
Exactly.
Right.
But that was I think, a brilliant point that you have out of this particular economic system that you must be materialistic or the system will fail. So, but on the other hand, and then it's interesting that the food pattern should parallel that, and at the same time you're told to be skinny as a rail and so on. There's just one more thing, and that is the divide, because it's often brought up that poor people tend to be disproportionately heavy.
Right.
And you had a point about that.
Yeah, well, and that's interesting because some of the, again, I was combing through evidence, and it's uneven evidence, and I can't tell you that my evidence is better than the other evidence. I was looking for things that just to give us pause about our what's the word I'm looking for? This kind of power through this is the only way we can think of it. One-dimensional thing. And so one of the things I found is a study that showed that people in the lower income brackets did not eat more calories than people in higher income brackets.
Yes, that was interesting.
Yeah, and it didn't differ by race either.
Right. Okay.
And so there are other possible answers to why poor people are bigger. And one of them is, again, the stress hormones.
Yes.
But it's also, we have to look at the inverse issue, which is, while being thin doesn't guarantee that you will be wealthy, being fat guarantees that you will not be generally.
Or disproportionately.
Because there is discrimination against fat people all along the life cycle, in schools, in jobs, etc.
Yes.
So there's other reasons that there's an association, a correlation between
other things that you need to look at. I think was a very important point in that.
Right.
So I urge people to take a look at this, and researchers also, because one of the problems with modern research, I think it's not just our culture, but it's an interesting thing about modern scientific research is it tends to be hyper narrow, so that people don't look at, they spend 40 years looking at this one particular little thing, factor.
And that's what what I get to do is the type of social science that I am, and I do engage with science, but I'm also saying, okay, what are the assumptions behind science?
Right, and that comes from the social background, the social aspect, I should say, orientation of your a particular background. That's very welcome in any case. Now, this year you are at Radcliffe having a wonderful time, you said. And your project is a book of all things on strawberries.
Right.
I think this is a favorite fruit everywhere, of course, a major crop. And we would not expect a book on strawberries. What would motivate a book on strawberries?
There's another book on strawberries. I didn't write it. There was another one, but it was on paper. Well, what motivates a book on strawberries? So strawberries have probably, they do have the highest toxic chemical load of any fruit or vegetable.
Yes, always on the top.
And they have pretty poor labor conditions as well.
Yes, thanks
And
for
so,
bringing that
and so
up.
strawberries have gotten a lot of bad press. Some of it deserved and some of it maybe not. But so strawberries are, you know, it's kind of in some ways a typical high value crop in California, which tends to depend on toxic chemicals
Yes,
and
very
tends to
much.
have poor labor conditions, but strawberries are kind of the pinnacle of that. But what motivated this research was actually, it came from the obesity book, which is that there was this fight, this regulatory battle over this chemical, methyl iodide.
Yes.
Methyl iodide was supposed to replace methyl bromide. Methyl bromide has been a favored chemical of strawberry producers since 1960s. It's a soil fumigant.
Thank you. Yes.
As is methyl iodide. It's a soil fumigant that's used pre-plant, so it doesn't affect consumers. It's used pre-plant to rid the soil of pathogens, nematodes, little worms, and weeds. But mainly,
and the fungus?
Well, the fungus, Verticillium dahlia, which I'll get to in a minute, is one of these soil pathogens.
Okay.
It's a soil disease that causes plants to wilt and die. But I'm getting ahead.
That's
so I
right.
kind of want to say what motivated this. So there was this big fight over methyl iodide. And because it's more toxic than methyl bromide. Methyl bromide was being phased out because it's an ozone depleting chemical that's no longer allowed by the Montreal Protocol, with some exceptions that do apply to the strawberry industry. So methyl iodide, for the first time I can remember, a coalition of foodies and environmental activists and farm worker activists and anti-pesticide activists and public health people got together to fight this thing. And I was really interested in that, and I was also interested to know whether the possibility that methyl iodide could be causing having epigenetic effects, having epigenetic effects on farm worker children, because farm workers are the ones most exposed to it. I was wondering if that was entering the regulatory debate. Well, it turns out it wasn't. But it was a great question, and I got National Science Foundation funding to pursue a project. And the project, I got two different grants actually, and one was looking at, so what happened is methyl iodide was taken off the market because of this regulatory battle.
Now that was the first and really bad one.
That was a really bad one.
Okay.
That was a bad one. All the methyl bromide's been around a lot longer.
Okay.
So I got a grant to look at how that happened, looking at the regulatory debate, and then I also got a grant to look at what farmers were going to do without methyl bromide and now without methyl iodide.
Okay.
And so I wrote a bunch of articles on that, but really this book evolved out of things that I just wasn't expecting. And what I saw was just how interlocked the whole strawberry system was, that so many things had co-evolved, including fumigation, including plant breeding, including the use of plastic tarps. All these kind of technologies that had evolved to control soil pathogens had now made it near impossible to farm without fumigants. Mm-hmm. And so the book is really about how these advantages of strawberry growing in California, and there were many advantages, turned into a set of threats. And because all these techniques are co-evolved, and now the industry is very locked into a particular way of doing things.
Yes. Is that with the scale of the production, for one thing, the destruction of the soil goes in there, but is that like interlocked in the sense that you get a problem, then you get a solution, then you get a problem as a result of that? Is it all like that?
It's kind of like that, but let me give
messier?
Let me give you a really specific, because it's not, let me give you a more specific example.
Not a chain.
Yeah, it's not necessarily a chain, and I've been thinking about that very question. Is it, let me just start from here. Mm-hmm. When the strawberry industry was just kind of a specialty crop industry. It wasn't even an industry, and it just, people started growing strawberries for the market in California. Now there are strawberries all over the country. starting about 1920s, 1930s, they started seeing blight in their fields. And there was a lot of different kind of diseases. They went to the University of California, which is a land-grant university, helped them figure out what was going on. And they identified one of these pathogens as being Verticillium dahliae, which is a fungus. So the university got in the business of trying to solve the strawberry industry's problems. And so one of the first things they did, besides identifying the pathogen, is they started a plant breeding program. And they were kind of supposed to breed for disease resistance, but they started breeding for productivity.
Ah.
Right? They started breeding for productivity. And they also started breeding for shippability, so for
yes,
strawberries that wouldn't rot.
Yes.
They started breeding so by productivity I mean yield. They started breeding for size, because I think that's what consumers
cosmetics
want.
and
They didn't breed for taste much, as we all know. So breeding starts taking off. Anyway, then they try, but they still have to deal with these pathogens. They try a bunch of different things. Finally, I mean, long story short, they get to fumigation. They start fumigating in the 60s. They find that a combination of methyl bromide and chloropicrin work really well together. Chloropicrin is a wartime tear gas.
Ah, right. That's
it was
the
used
tear
in World
gas.
War
That's
One,
the
right?
tear
You know,
gas that you mentioned.
and they used to when soldiers had gas masks on, they'd spray or release chloropicrin, and the enemy would, and soldiers would tear their gas mask off to vomit, because
and get
the full array of exposures. So that's chloropicrin. So chloropicrin and methyl bromide together was like this, had this je ne sais quoi. It really worked well for the growers. So once they start fumigating, then growers no longer have to rotate ground.
Right.
So they start planting year after year on the same block. And when you do that, and their strawberries are grown, strawberries love sandy soil, and they love coastal temperatures, the temperate temperatures that come off the Pacific Ocean. So they also bred for longevity. I mean, for strawberries to be harvested for a long period of time, because unlike, I understand Massachusetts has a 3-week strawberry season, the strawberry season in California is about 10 months.
Wow. Yes.
Yes. And that's because they have different varietals that grow in different places, and that's why you're getting California strawberries in markets here in Cambridge and Boston right now, because they're coming from California, maybe some from Mexico that have been using varietals that they're probably right now they're short day varietals that don't require on a long day.
I see. Yeah.
So fumigation allows growers to not have to worry about rotating the ground. They now can concentrate all of their breeding on productivity, on extending the length of the season, on shippability, so they don't have to worry about disease resistance anymore.
Right.
And then they have then they have this issue of and then but then they need land. And what happens is all these things come
together
and embedded, like for instance in the cost of land. So strawberry land is extraordinarily expensive. It's based on the presumption that you're going to get strawberries year after year. They're an extraordinarily high value crop. Just to give you a sense of what an acre of strawberry land, today it's an investment of $70,000 per acre.
That's amazing.
And right now the profit margins are coming down for a bunch of different reasons, but so that means they're
still significant.
72,000, so 2,000 an acre. So as I said, they like the same real estate, those strawberries do, that suburbanites do. Mm-hmm. So there's other pressures on strawberry land than even the kind of land value of strawberry production. And so the land prices are going up. They're going to continue to go up even if the strawberry business declines. And so that puts a huge constraint on what growers can do.
Yes, right. So there are multiple things to worry
Converging.
about. You start out with a highly profitable crop. It's worth investing in all the
right.
breeding
Right,
effort
right.
and so on. But there's a very destructive element, first of all, in the soil.
Right.
But the other, I'm just curious, are you addressing the health issue for the workers in the fields that are subjected to this stuff?
Right. Well, the focus of this book is on soil fumigants and as they relate to these soil pathogens. Now, as it happens, these fumigants, again, I don't want to mislead your viewers. They are not. They don't affect consumers because they're planted in the ground. I mean, they're put in the ground before planting. So the people most affected are those who live or work or play nearby these fumigations. Now, the people who apply the fumigants are fully. They have the masks and everything, but there's other people who work on fumigations that are not fully protected. I mean, I've driven through strawberry land and seeing that, they put these plastic tarps on after they fumigate to keep the fumigant in, and also somewhat as a public health issue. But those tarps come loose, they fly up, and you see people without any mask going in and shoveling dirt on them. So there are incidents of pesticide drift. The industry likes to say that they're minor accidents, but they happen with with regularity. And then there's the issue of the political vulnerability of these workers, many of whom, not the fumigation workers, but many of whom are undocumented.
That's right.
And they can't
very vulnerable.
complain.
They can't complain.
They can't complain because they will get
in trouble.
There
are two things. You started out by saying strawberries are the #1 toxic produce. So what is in the strawberries if that's not the fumigants? What is it we're getting?
I would say the highest chemical load, but it turns out the strawberries are on the environmental working groups, Dirty Dozen. They're the top. There's fungicides.
Okay, so that's other stuff is in there too. So it's not just the soil
and that
part.
leaves residues, but the fumigants don't leave residues.
Okay, got it. The other is, we have only like a couple minutes left here, but I would like to go back again to this issue of people working around this environment. You had talked before about you don't look necessarily at the following 2 weeks. You might need to look at the next generation. If there are pregnant women in those fields or in that environment, for that matter, the men, is it affecting reproduction and the health?
Thank you for asking that. I meant to come back to that. Yeah, so that's a big question.
It's an unknown. Is that
there is this big study going on in Salinas. It's called the Chamaco Studies. It's like an acronym, but it means children in Spanish. And they're actually following cohorts, and they're finding, that they're finding all sorts of reproductive issues from an array of chemicals. As part of my project, we did talk to farm workers, but the farm workers are, again, they don't necessarily pay attention to fumigants, they just pay attention to what's making them sick. And we did have I think we talked to, like 70 or so farm workers, and many did complain of either having experience or knowing someone who had some miscarriages or problematic pregnancies, and the women in particular were quite nervous about it. But we can't really identify from what chemicals. But
and some of that stuff, the industry has industries have a way of preventing research on something, so maybe it hasn't been researched adequately or addressed yet.
The industry certainly doesn't particularly like that research on that, but I don't think that the strawberry industry per se is suppressing science. It's been a tricky project, because I wanted to talk to the people in the strawberry industry, and I have to take seriously what they have to say.
Of course.
To even have that conversation with them. I think that the chemical industry I think that they suppress science, but I don't think the strawberry industry does
Oh,
so much.
no, I meant, sorry, yes, because
Yeah.
the chemical
Yeah,
industry
yeah.
is kind of famous for,
Yeah.
for this kind of
Yeah.
thing. But in any case, to just sort of sum up, and I'm sorry because this is really very interesting, but what's your prognosis for the industry before we close off?
Well, that's a chapter I just was working on today.
How about that?
Yeah,
That's fresh in your mind.
Although right now it's in that mess. I think that the prognosis, it's really hard to know. I mean, there's several different options they're looking at for farming without fumigants, because finally the strawberry industry is seeing the writing on the wall, and they know that they're not going to have the fumigants aren't long for this world for them. So there's different sorts of options ranging from, I mean, some people would love drop-in replacements that just work like the chemicals. Some are looking at growing in soilless substrate in kind of greenhouses, which is a terrible solution for California, because their biggest competitive advantage is the climate and the soil. And so once they take it into a greenhouse, you're going to grow strawberries in
Alaska
Boston and New Jersey. And apparently New York, New Jersey has lots and lots of greenhouse agriculture. And then they're also looking at anaerobic soil disinfestation, which is adding a carbon source in water and plastic and covering it, and they're having mixed results. But here's the main thing. Most of these are going to, a lot of the best solutions are capital intensive and or require knowledge, patience, and so what's happened, I think at the very least, low resource growers are getting shaken out. They already are. Now, some people in the strawberry industry would welcome a shakeout because their prices are low. I saw 99-cent strawberries the other day in Boston that were for a big box. So some would welcome a shakeout, but I think that's going to happen regardless. But whether we move to a kind of another high-tech solution that may or may not work, or try more agroecological techniques, it's tough. And even the agroecological techniques are tough because of these issues with land values, with a changed ecology that we don't even have the knowledge.
It's really just able to be studied at this time where they're learning more.
Right.
Well, I wish you the best. I look forward to the book, certainly. And
Me too.
I think it's a big, you'll be glad when it's all over. I think it's a wonderful idea. A lot of people will enjoy looking at this because we don't think about all of this. When we think about those little boxes of strawberries. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us, and enjoy the rest of the year at Radcliffe.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.